Yeah? Yay! For my next trick, I'll do a talk about animation. Yay! Yeah, actually, we're going to start things out we'll get a little bit serious for a minute, friends. We have this tendency in web design to really be stuck on like static deliverables. And it's not really a bad thing. They've worked really, really well for us in the past. You mock up some things in Sketch, maybe a screen, maybe some like components, all of this stuff, and then you go and you build a thing based on these like static things that you've made. And it's worked really well, but it also kind of puts us in a corner when it comes to things like animation. Using static comps and relying on static deliverables actually makes our job harder when it comes to animation. And we kind of force ourselves to like leave animation to the very end, right? Like if your whole process is like, make a mock-up in Sketch, send that to the developers make it happen, you kind of get forced to wait to the very end to think about animation. And that tends to cause us a lot of problems. So when we leave animation to the very end, when we treat it like this extra thing, when you're like, hey, it'd be cool if we could animate this, but like, we don't really have to. Just do it if we have time. We'll wait to the end. If there's time, we'll do it later. We end up backing ourselves in this corner where it's like we have one chance to do it right. If you've gotten to the thing, you're like, it's almost done. Now let's just add the animation. It's really hard because if you don't get it right the first time and that one chance you have to do it, it's just never going to work out. And chances are, when you only have one chance to do something, you just can't quite get it right the first time. Those bottom ones aren't bears. I don't know what they are. So what it really comes down to is that like good UI animation, the kind of animation that you want in your products, that you want in your designs, takes your whole team. It can't be something that one person walks in at the end and is like, boom, animation, it's done. It just doesn't work like that. You need everyone along the entire way to like feel that it's valuable, feel that it's important. And then on the technical side of it, you need both animations that are designed very well as animations that are built well. You could have an amazing idea for a well-designed animation, and if at the end, like underlying code isn't any good and it's not performant, it's not really going to work out very well. And you could have a really well-coded animation that happens to be horribly designed, and that doesn't work out well either. So there's this darn problem of needing to like talk to the people you work with and communicate around animation. But when we do it, the whole idea of like using animation and using it well becomes so much easier. Better communication around animation can get us some really helpful bonuses, like getting easier buy-in. If you've ever felt like that one person in your whole company that actually wants to use animation, you're like, it's a great idea and stuff, we should do it, and everyone else is like, whatever. Talking about animation and communicating around it earlier and more clearly, more purposefully, can help you get that buy-in and help people be a little more receptive to it internally. You can come up with better ideas. Like if you start talking about animation earlier, you have more than one chance to get it right. Like if you tried those bears a second time, they'd probably look a little bit better, hopefully. Depends on your baking skills. Thankfully, animation's a little easier for web people than baking. And we can also get to some repeatable, reusable patterns. We can make decisions once, document them, and then not have to make them again. You can save future you time, you can save your teammates time, or having to worry about a thing that you've already taken care of for them. So one of the biggest things we can do to communicate better around animation and to really get better at creating animation and doing it well is to think about the deliverables we use throughout our design process that help us talk about animation. So deliverables really being like the thing that makes you talk about stuff. It's like such a big, serious word, but it's really about starting conversations. And there's 3 types of deliverables that I find are really useful for animation that we tend not to use as much as maybe we could. So the first one on that list is storyboards and sketches, which is one of those things where a lot of people are like, oh, I start out all of my designs sketching anyways. It's like, you can sketch animation too, you totally can. Even though the word storyboard sometimes is a bit of a loaded term and a little bit scary because most people tend to think of animation and storyboard together, and then they think of the amazing artistry of Pixar storyboards, which thankfully that level of skill is not required for the kind of storyboards we need. We can make storyboards that look like more like this, which are not as beautiful, but are totally meaningful and have something in there that we can pull out of it and help us remember what it is we want to talk about, or demonstrate a thing to somebody else. So storyboards and sketching storyboards specifically are really, really helpful for thinking about things like where is there potential for animation in this flow. When you're in the early stages of a design, early stages of a product, and you're starting to think about like what are the important things people will do with this product, you have those conversations, that's a really great time to start bringing up the idea of like, hey, could animation be helpful here? Could it be useful in like this checkout flow and this sign-up flow? Is there a place we could do it? Let's try storyboarding out some ideas. It's also really great for thinking about like how, on a more specific scale of how animation can be useful in like one particular screen. Like, is there a way in this one particular screen's layout we can use animation to make it more clear what's happening, to make it easier to understand, easier to use? And storyboards are also really great for just those sort of like random crazy ideas where I feel like there's like this excitement, especially at the very beginning of projects, where you're like, there's so many things we could do, oh my goodness, let's do all the things. Like, that's a really great place to use storyboards as well. When you have an idea, maybe you're not like quite sure if it'll work out, but if you try to storyboard it out, it forces you to like go through the logic of how it could work, and then it gives you something to show your teammates or someone else so you can talk about it and they know what it is you're thinking about besides just, crazy dances and gestures. My really favorite thing about storyboards, though, is the idea that literally anyone can make one. Like, you can hand someone a marker for a whiteboard, you can hand them a pencil and paper, and they can make a storyboard, which is what makes them so powerful. They can storyboard out their animation ideas. They don't have to be designers, they don't have to be developers, they can be product managers, they could be clients. Anyone can kind of pitch in and storyboard out some idea they have for animation, which is really, really great for buy-in in the sense that like if they've participated in the decision-making process of where animation might be used or how it might be used by making storyboards, then they feel like they have something more invested in that process. And also, you never know who's going to come up with great design ideas. They come from the craziest places. The other thing that's really great about them is like you don't have to put a lot of time into them. You can spend a few minutes making a storyboard, and if you're like, oh, nope, that was not a good idea, you just like kind of crumple it up, throw it out. It's like it never happened. It was never there. No one needs to know. You didn't invest any time in a solution that you realize won't work out. Storyboards, though, I feel like are still kind of intimidating to people in the sense that like if you hand someone like a marker or a pencil and you're like, that sounds like a great idea, draw it out. And they're like, no, it's cool, I don't draw. Drawing is not a thing I do. Because drawing in front of other people is scary. But my friend Eva Lotta Lamb, who talks a lot about sketching interfaces, has a really great like 3-step thing for drawing out interactions, which I've realized are also super useful for drawing storyboards. So, to steal her list of 3 things, there are really only 3 things you need to include in any storyboard, and thinking of this list is easier than just looking at the blank page. So for storyboards, you want to have some kind of trigger of like, what starts off this animation? Usually, that could be anything from like a page load to like a person clicks on a thing, or someone makes this gesture. Whatever the thing is, something starts that sequence of actions. And then the next thing to include, as I just sort of alluded to, is the actual action of like what will actually animate, what will move, what will fade, what will happen. And that's something you could spend a few little drawings to spell out. It could be something you can fit in one frame. Totally fine. The idea is you just want to have it there. And the third thing, which I think is really the key to what makes this work, is including the quality of how that animation should move. You could be like, hey, this thing, this modal box should slide in from the bottom. Well, how does it slide? Does it slide in quickly? Does it slide in like urgently? All of those things, like the words you use to describe how it moves, describing that quality of animation, is really, packs in a lot of information and communicates a lot about the intention of what it is you're trying to do. It makes it easier to have the conversations around all of these sorts of things. So if we take that list and apply it to a slightly messy, but yet totally amazingly illustrated storyboard for a drag and drop interaction, we can look at where all 3 of those things might come in. The very first bit where we actually have the hand icon, the idea of like this person selects a thing and starts dragging it, that's your action, is like person grabs a thing in the list. And we also have this idea of like they might have a dragging action as well. Then when it comes to the action of what will take place, that's the trigger, the person like dragging the thing, that triggers this animation. The actual action of the animation is like the other list items moving out of the way. And then there's also this like really well-detailed illustrated shadow that I'm like totally proud of. My drawing skills are amazing. You should hire me as an illustrator. Don't do that. And then, so we have that as our action. That's what happens. The other things slide out of the way. We have this, we want to do maybe something to show that there's a greater depth as it's going. And then we take care of the quality part in just like one word, where we're like, the other items move quickly out of the way. So you get that feel of like, okay, they move quickly out of the way. It's not going to be like a, hey, your list is expanding. There's going to be some sort of quick action. It'll probably feel very light and slidey because it's going to be quickly. You can start getting into those conversations. And with just these 3 little panels, we've addressed how this drag and drop interaction, or really the drag and the drop interaction part should happen, or could happen, and we can discuss those steps along the way. It might not be a super long discussion, but when having this storyboard in front of us, we all know we're talking about the same thing. And we won't have 4 different versions of quickly or where they would slide in and out of the way. If you want to learn more about Eva Lada's really great sketching interface ideas and advice, I interviewed her about it for my newsletter because she just had so much great stuff. I wanted to share it with everyone. So storyboards and sketches are pretty awesome for like those early ideas. They're really great for getting people who maybe aren't your typical designer and developer involved in the process of thinking about like, where can we use animation for this? How can we give better feedback? Is animation a way to do it? It's really great for those kinds of things, but it doesn't really get into the details of exactly how animation should work. So if we wanted to go like one step further, like higher fidelity, one step up in detail, we can use deliverables like motion comps. Motion comps are sometimes called animatics or like motion mockups. They have 3 names, maybe more names, only 3 I'm aware of, but they're still really useful no matter which name you use. They tend to really be like more like a video playback of what an animation could look like, kind of like, like faking the version of what could happen. It's just showing what would move and when and how and where. They tend to be very high fidelity in the quality of the animation. Like our storyboard, we're just like, it moves quickly. In a motion comp, you could be like, it moves with this exact easing curve and this exact timing. You can get very, very specific and really dig into those details, which tends to be the kind of reason you might make motion comps for. To me, I think the biggest reason to use motion comps is when you get yourself into situations like this. If you're like, hey, I'm a designer. I designed the closed state and the open state for this search bar. It goes from here to there. You're like, here's the open state, here's the end state. Go ahead, developers, make this animate. And you're like, I should just animate in between. And if you look at this, you're like, okay, cool, it just animates in between. But there are like 8 things that change in position or visibility or whatever between the closed state and the open state. That's a lot of different ways this thing can move. So if you hand it off just like this, whatever developer is on the other end of this handoff has to not only come up with exactly how all the 8 things should move, and like they have to do that on top of building out the entire animation. So it's like all the logic and all the interior stuff of how the animation works falls on them. And maybe as the designer, your idea of how those 8 things should move aren't the same as the developer's idea of how those 8 things should move. And then things get weird and terrible, and we could have just avoided the whole thing by like making a motion comp. So if instead of handing off something like this, our theoretical designer handed off something like this instead, and they were like, hey, here's the closed state and the end state, and here's how I'm thinking it should move in between them. It's a very short little animation clip. It's just like, oh, it slides over, and then the actual input bar fades in, and then those 3 tags come up with a little bit of a fade and a move, and just in an offset manner. Like being able to just provide that, and also be able to, making that really leaves a lot of those, or answers a lot of those questions, and leaves a lot less up to interpretation or available time or whatever else happens that makes things harder than they need to be. Another great thing about motion comps is like you can talk to the people who will be building the animation while you make these. It's not like designers have to be out in their little silos and then just like toss the videos over the fence. These are a really great way to actually like have conversations about animation as well. Another thing motion comps get used for a lot is thinking about just like style and branding of animation. This one's very much logical, like where should things go? But you'll see a lot of things on Dribble. This is one that Dan Mall made, where he was thinking about like, how should this weather app I'm making, how should it look? How should it load in? What should the movements look like? And by creating a little motion comp like this, he's kind of established the sort of personality that this weather app might have. The motion's like, very direct, but also a little bit light and floaty, and it kind of gives like a friendly weather feel. You also see things like this on other motion comps on Dribble. This one is one that Mixed Panel made, where they're kind of looking at an even bigger picture idea. They seem to be looking at more of like, how should our brand move? And they have a little thing like this, where they just kind of like then load up all of their features. And they create this great like tension, right? They're like, how will I forget what the question is. What will be in your app? And then there's like this kind of pause, and then they're like, here are our features, and suddenly everything speeds up. And they've really changed the feel of the motion between those two pieces and really thought about like how their brand will exist in motion. So motion comps are really great for that too, because you just have this space, this visual space to explore the details of animation, and you can change your mind and redo things without having to worry about like how the code base is affected. So motion comps are really great at answering questions like exactly how animation should look, which things should move and when, and even the idea of like, does the animation we're working on fit the personality of our brand? It happens all the time. We see animation that like might be good on its own, but just doesn't fit its context. There's a bank that I use that for whatever reason, when I make a payment on my account, this modal thing just kind of falls in from the bottom, all bouncy, like, hey, would you like to make a payment? And I'm like, I'm sending you like thousands of dollars. Why are you bouncing at me? And it's like, I don't know, I want to make a payment? And I'm like, oh, this does not fit. And like having things fit the context and fit your brand is so important. And motion comps are a really great place to explore that before you're the bank with the bouncy modal. Some tools that people use for motion comps are things like After Effects. That gets used a lot, especially by people who have a background in motion design and already know it. Also Flash, or as we're supposed to call it now, Adobe Animate CC. Same thing, different logo. And then also something like Hype, if you want to get out of a slightly different ecosystem. And all three of these, the thing that makes them so useful for motion comps is the fact that they give you this wide open space, right? They give you like a canvas, you can make it whatever size you want, you can put whatever you want on it, and they have a visual timeline somewhere for you to like visually control the things on that canvas, which can be really handy in motion comps when you're trying to like come up with creative solutions and you aren't necessarily like you don't necessarily have a complete end goal in mind. You just have an idea of where you're going. One other thing that can make motion comps really useful is a lot of people use it to hand off, like we were talking about in that first example, like hand off animations from designers to developers. And if you're going to do that, a really great tip is to include some handy details, like the duration and repeat and delay values, how many times something repeats, what kind of easing it used, all those sorts of things. No one can tell from watching a really short 5-second video exactly what easing curve was used. If you can pass that along with the motion comp, so much easier for getting things done. And it really helps you share the work across design and development instead of being like, hey, developers, just guess what curve I used. It's cool. Because that's hard. No one can do that. It's like a mean pub quiz. So motion comps are great for exploring that sort of creative expression of what the animation should do. But if we wanted to get one more higher fidelity than that, we would get to interactive prototypes. And the biggest difference between those and motion comps is the fact that they're interactive. Motion comps generally are not, or are not fully interactive. So interactive prototypes could be things like this, which is like, hey, how should our menu slide into view? And we're like, maybe like this. Cool. And then you can just click the hamburger icon a few more times for the video. And then the thing that makes them very different is you get to get a look at how that animation feels. So many times I hear from folks who are well-seasoned motion designers who have gotten into this whole UI animation game, and the biggest thing they tell me is different is the timing. The timing that they've grown to be really accustomed to for animation you just watch. The whole set of rules around timing changes when you interact with it. An animation that looks good may not actually feel good to interact with, and interactive prototypes help you figure that out. So they can help you figure out what an animation will be like to use. Also, does it feel right in the context? Does it make sense? If I'm in the middle of this task and then I go and this animation happens, does that fit? And then, of course, the idea of how animation works with real data. Just like the same way your design might look beautiful when everyone's name is Jane Smith, and then suddenly it kind of falls apart when someone has a name with like actual letters in it. Animation, the same thing can happen with animation. An animation might look great when there's 3 of them, and then suddenly when there's 20, everything just falls apart. And prototypes are a great way to find where those weaknesses are and fix them before that something is launched in production. So some tools that get used for prototypes, for interactive prototypes around animation especially, there's a few things, well, it seems like so many prototyping tools out there. Things like Principal, Atomic, Flinto, and all of those things. And those ones tend to have a lot of smart defaults you can customize. Like they tend to have a lot of like built-in events, built-in gestures even, that you can build your interactive prototypes off of. They have like just kind of that nice scaffolding you can work from. Things like Framer, or even maybe like rolling your own HTML, CSS, JavaScript kind of situation, gives you a more wide open place of things to play with. There's some presets with things like Framer, but you can really make it do whatever you want. And I'm going to dig into interactive prototypes just a little bit more because I find them to be the most useful for me. So Framer is very code heavy. It tends to look a little bit like this, or code centric really. You write some code on the one side, you see a preview on the other side. Thankfully, you can turn that hand off because it creeps me out. I'm just like, no, put it away. I really actually wish, if anyone works for Framer, this is my $1 million idea for you, there should be a cat paw option. Because if that was a cat paw, I would leave it. As a human hand, creepy. Cat paw, fun. Crazy how that works. There's also things like Atomic, which tends to be one that's a little bit more visual. Like many of those motion comp tools, it has a visual timeline for you to work with, except you can also manipulate DOM elements with it, which is pretty handy. Atomic is also browser-based, which is helpful if you're using a PC, because many of these tools are Mac only for whatever reason. My favorite way, though, is to actually just kind of roll your own on something like CodePen. Like, use the things that the end product will actually be made with to create the prototype. Most of what I work on is on the web, so I tend to do a lot of CodePen demos of things like this, or CodePen prototypes. And my favorite thing about, or favorite way to work with these, this is like first big secret I'll reveal, is like, this looks like I did a whole lot of work, right? Like, it looks like I laid out a whole page in CodePen and then made a whole modal and like animated it in. Like, this probably took me days. Right? Almost convincing? Sort of? Kind of? You're already on to me? All right. But really, it's just a screenshot with a button in front of it. Yep. It's really great to start putting this together. Like if the developer you're working with has gone to get coffee, you just like throw a screenshot in there and start like coding the animation, and they come back with their coffee and they're like, what? And you're like, yeah, I just work real fast. Or you can just prototype the small bits of what you're actually looking to investigate over top of a screenshot, which is really handy when you're like trying to come up with, like redesigns or a new way to do a thing for an existing product. Super handy and quick and really useful because you're immediately in the context you'll really be in, but you didn't have to do a whole lot of work to get there. When you use HTML and CSS, you can also do things like make yourself some handy like Sass variables or use like existing design tokens. All of those things are usually handier to use that way. You can even use something like the Greensock animation platform. Like even if that's not what you'll be using in the end, it can be a great set of like kind of pre-made things that you can use. And they do a really great job of like giving you these timeline markers and letting you get really deep into some easing, different easing structures, which can be a lot faster and easier than writing it all yourself just to make a prototype. So you can get pretty fancy with that. So second secret I reveal to all of you, I guess it's third since Ola's question made me reveal another secret, is if you're presenting an interactive prototype, you should always ask, like once you show it, demo it, and then be like, do you want to see it in slow motion? No one will ever say no. No one would ever say no to seeing it in slow motion. And then you just get to look all that much cooler. So when you're showing things off in the browser, you can just go into like your dev tools in Chrome or Firefox and actually slow it down, which is both impressive to everyone you're presenting to, but then also gives you time to actually talk about why it is you made the animation decisions you did. You can say things like, hey, this modal slides in with a slight 3D rotation to really emphasize the depth between the content and the modal. That's hard to do when the animation you made happens in 0.4 seconds. When you slow it down into slow motion, you can actually talk about those decisions, support why they were made and why they're there and why they exist, while also showing off. So it's like a total win-win. So all three of these things, our storyboards, our motion comps, our prototypes, they're the kind of things where, there's no magic number of them that you need to make. You don't need to use them all. You don't need to go in a specific order. It's really about what's going to work best for you and your team. You can share them internally, you can share them externally, whatever makes sense for you. Some people never share them with clients. Some people share them with clients all the time, depending on how they work and what they're working on. The most important part really is to just get that idea, get some feedback and input along the way. Actually, share these things, use them to talk about animation and encourage that communication so you avoid that idea of that big surprise at the end of being like, oh yeah, and I thought it would animate. Can you just take care of that? Because no one likes that situation. It never works out super well. So once you've got some of these animation decisions made, it's really helpful to actually write some of them down. Document them in either a very official capacity or less official capacity, really whatever makes sense to you. It's great if you can include it in an official style guide, but if what you've got available to you and the way you tend to work is more informal, some informal documentation can work well. So the one thing you want to start with first for any sort of this documentation is really the idea of what your brand should do in motion. What does your brand say with motion? In much the same way you would think about does this typeface have the personality that matches my brand? You can think about motion in the same way. The really handy thing about this is you rarely have to start from scratch, because there's usually some design decisions, some design principles have been set up, some design values have been set up ahead of time. So you can use things like your brand pillars, your voice and tone, all of those things to figure out what your brand should say in motion. How does it exist when it moves? All of those things you can pull from those existing things instead of starting from scratch. So for example, I've worked with a few different clients on how to make this happen. Intuit is not one of them, but they have a really good and clear voice and tone document, so I'm going to use them as an example. If you're not familiar with Intuit, they make accounting software. Accounting and animation are two things you always thought went together, huh? Yeah, I know. So they have a really clear and just super succinct voice and tone where they say things like, okay, we want our voice and tone to lead the way. They have some handy characteristics, supporting characteristics about it, where they're like, our voice and tone should be human, reassuring, and friendly. You're like, all right, cool. They also want their voice and tone to be simple. Their supporting characteristics for that are the idea of being clear and minimal and sparse. You're like, okay, cool, I can work with that. And then they have a third one where they say they want to have fun, and they want to engage people, and they want to be energetic and friendly and cheerful. And you're like, okay, those are all things they can work with. All of this stuff was written for their voice and tone. It was written about how they would write words and copy. We can apply that to motion too. So if we pick just a few key principles, or a few key supporting characteristics, rather, that's what they called them. We can say that first one was they had this human, reassuring, and friendly. They also had, more than that. Do we want to advance the slide? There we go. They also had crisp, minimal, and concise. So you're like, okay, those kind of all go together. And then they also had that last one, that friendly one of being lively, charming, and cheerful. All right. So let's make these animate. Let's apply these to some animation instead of the copy they were intended for. So if we wanted to look at the first one, the friendly and charming, one way they could pull that off is they could have, things that just have a little bit of follow-through, a little bit of extra energy. Where, this one is kind of look who successfully done some accounting. Pretty nice. It has that little bit of energy to it. It's friendly. It has that little bit of bounce in and out. Just a slight one, though, not too crazy. It gets that friendly and charming feel across. If they wanted to focus more on concise and reassuring, they could go with animation that might look something like this. There's no bounce on that one. It's the same square doing the same thing, but in a different manner. And in this case, it's really more can I help you with that double entry transaction? It's much more, there's less energy. It's not as friendly, but it's much more assured. It knows where it's going, and it just ends up there, which can be one way they can communicate that. And then one of the other ones they had was minimal. That was a value they had around their voice and tone. And we can do that in animation too. Same animation, same box, just by creating a smaller motion. Those first two all came all the way up from the bottom. That second one just kind of faded in a few pixels down, but still gave you that same impression that it came from the bottom. Still reads the same way as far as where it came from and where it went, but looks incredibly different personality-wise. So all of those things they could use, kind of figure out what their brand would be like in motion. And then they can move forward from that and actually like document some of these decisions so they don't have to do it again. So that every person who animates isn't like, ooh, should we use this kind of easing or this kind of easing? Oh, I don't know. They can actually establish those ground rules so everyone can make smarter decisions faster, or the good decisions faster. So a couple of things that you definitely would want to document. I think like the core things, like we can make style guides that are like endlessly wrong or long. Whew, that was weird. They're probably still right, but you can get very verbose with style guides. But I think there's like some key things when it comes to motion that if you put them in your style guide, just these key-based decisions, you can get really far from just a few things. So things like documenting your decisions around timing and duration. There's some basic things, like shorter durations are better for things like hover, and longer durations are better for large movements. Okay, that's pretty, like hopefully everyone's good on that. But there's also the idea of like how those longer and shorter things work. What's long, what's short? What do you interpret as long and short? So you can establish some things like a scale like this, of being like, hey, if you have a hover effect, be on the low end of the scale. If you're doing something big and crazy, be on the larger end of the scale. People can make their own decisions within that. IBM's carbon design system does that a little bit, where they're like, hey, we have like these three kinds of, or there's more than three, these specific categories of timing. Like if you have a small thing, use this timing. If you have, like a page transition, use this timing. And they've made that timing decision easy for whoever it is that needs to decide how long their animation should take. Salesforce gets really, really specific in theirs. They're just like, here's a list of timings, pick one, go for it. And places like material design get very verbose about it, where they kind of talk about like, here's our like general idea on timing. Here's where you might use this one. Here's where you might need to change your mind. And they go into, there's a lot left open to interpretation. But it really depends on your audience. Like, does your team want those direct variables, or do they want the more room to make decisions themselves? It depends on who you're working with. Easing values is the other thing you definitely want to document. Selecting custom easing as like a very basic, like the very entry-level thing you might ever do for animation, and having a design system around animation can go really far. You can have like come up with your own specific ease in and ease outs, those kinds of things. Establishing an easing palette, the easings that you use for your product or your company will make the animations you create just feel a little different than the ones that are everywhere else, especially ones compared to ones that are using only the default keywords. So you could come up with things like this, where you're like, here's our custom ease in, here's our custom ease out, this is the cubic bezier they use, here's the SAS variable to pull them from our code base. And you should always make interactive demos too, because everyone likes clicking on things and having them animate. Salesforce does this with just like 4 lines. They're like, use ease in for this, use ease out for that, end of story. This is how we do it, much more structured. And material design, again, is much more verbose, where they're like, here's our standard curve and what it means, and they talk about everything in a little bit more detail. So at the very least, creating your own custom ease in and ease out will give you the start of a design system and a start of like some really well-made decisions around animation that are repeatable throughout your whole team, throughout your whole product. And it's also just like, it's a small move to make, but can get you very great results for that amount of effort that it takes. And in the end, if you've done those things, if you've thought about what your brand how it should move, how it could express itself in motion, its values around motion, if you thought about your durations and you thought about your easing, that alone can become a style guide. And if you look at the motion section of IBM's carbon design system, that really is what they've got there. They talk about easing, they talk about duration, and they talk about their values around animation. And that's a nice baseline that everyone can pull from, and that there's going to be this idea of a system behind your animation decisions, these commonalities, as well as like this shared base of like just good design decisions. So that way, if you have to make a really quick page transition, you can just go here, find the values you need, and you're done in like a minute, as opposed to having to really, really like labor over it for any amount of time. So motion design style guides don't have to be long and verbose. They just need to address the basic core things that you want to have going on. So if you found all of this talk about designing and interface animations fun and interesting, I wrote a book about it. It's called Designing Interface Animation. It has as many pictures of my dog in it as I could possibly fit in. Yeah, very important. Oh, I'm glad other people are in on that, because some people are like, who even cares? I'm like, dog? Um, and also, if you're more interested in learning about how to make these animations, how to code them, I'm doing some workshops with Sarah Drasner. The closest one to here is we have one in Paris in September. You could totally join us for that if you want. And with that, thanks so much for talking animation with me for a little while. Dun, dun.